Get on your knees. Pick it up. And don't you dare touch my counter again." Debbie Kessler said it loud enough for the whole gate to hear, and she said it with a smile still sitting on her face, the kind of smile that had nothing to do with kindness. A passport lay on the tile floor, face down, spinning to a stop near a pair of white sneakers, with a crease worn into the left toe. The woman standing over it did not answer. She bent down, picked it up, and stood back up slowly, like someone deciding exactly how much of this moment she was willing to give away for free. 22 years in the United States Army teaches a person how to disappear in plain sight, and Colonel Renée Calloway had learned the lesson better than almost anyone. That morning she looked like nobody. A navy blazer gone soft at the elbows, faded jeans, a leather carry-on with a zipper that pulled a little to the left, the strap worn pale where her hand always landed. No jewelry except a steel field watch on her wrist, the kind the Army stopped issuing back in 2013. She never checked a bag. She never rushed. She had crossed runways in Kandahar and hallways in the Pentagon with the same unhurried stride, and neither place had taught her to explain herself to anyone. That morning, before she left Fort Drexel, she had signed for a letter with a Department of Defense seal at the top. 2 lines mattered. Effective the coming Monday, she would be sworn in as Deputy Inspector General for the entire Department of Defense. She had read it 3 times, folded it along the same crease twice, and slid it into the inside pocket of her blazer, the pocket closest to her heart, next to a small brass coin her father had pressed into her palm the day she left for West Point. It was worn smooth on one side from 20 years of her thumb passing over it without thinking. "Duty above self," it read in letters so faded, now you had to already know they were there to read them. She drove to Denver International that morning, the way she drove everywhere, with both hands on the wheel and the radio off. Concourse C Gate C31. A gate like every other gate in America. Plastic chairs bolted to the floor, a vending machine missing the sprite, a security camera blinking red in the corner where the ceiling met the jet bridge doors. Nobody in that terminal looked twice at a plain woman in a worn blazer. She liked it that way. She had spent her whole career being underestimated by people who would spend the rest of their lives being wrong about her, and there was a kind of peace in letting them stay wrong for as long as possible. At the check-in counter, an elderly man in a cardigan struggled with a suitcase whose handle had jammed at an angle. He tugged twice, embarrassed, holding up the line. Renée stepped past her own spot and freed the handle with one motion, lifted the bag onto the scale, and said nothing more than "You're all set, sir." The man thanked her twice. A young gate agent nearby, 23 years old, knew enough to still believe every word of her training manual, watched the whole exchange and filed it away without knowing why it mattered yet. Her name was Megan Ortiz. She would remember that moment for the rest of her life, though she did not know it yet. Behind the counter at Gate C31 stood Debbie Kessler, 41 years old, 9 years with Meridian Sky Airlines. A gate agent whose smile could turn on and off like a light switch, depending entirely on who was standing in front of her. Right now, the switch was on. A couple in expensive linen stood at her counter, and Debbie leaned forward, laughing at something the husband had said, promising them an upgrade she winked and called our little secret. The couple walked away glowing. Debbie's smile followed them for exactly 3 steps, before it dropped off her face completely, like something unplugged. Her eyes moved down the line, past the family with matching backpacks, past the college student with headphones the size of dinner plates, and they landed on Renée Calloway. Worn blazer, sneakers, no rings, black. Something in Debbie's mouth tightened, just barely, just enough for Megan to catch it from 3 feet away. "Next," Debbie called out, and her voice had changed entirely, flat, cold. The warmth she had poured over the couple in linen was simply gone, as if it had been a performance for someone else's benefit the whole time. Renée stepped forward and placed her boarding pass on the counter, gently the way she set down everything. Debbie did not touch it. She looked at it from a distance first, the way you might look at something you suspected of being contagious. "First class," she read aloud. But she wasn't speaking to Renée. She was speaking to the line behind her, to the man in the polo shirt, 3 spots back, who leaned sideways to get a better look, to the woman with the rolling suitcase who tilted her head to listen. "I'll need to see your ID," Debbie said, holding her palm out flat, fingers straight, not open the way you'd offer a hand, but the way you'd wait for a dog to drop something at your feet. Renée reached into her blazer pocket and handed over her passport. Debbie took it between 2 fingers, the way you'd lift a used tissue off a table. She opened it slowly, holding it away from her body, her eyes moving from the photograph to Renée's face and back again. Once, twice, 5 times. "This doesn't even look like you," she muttered, setting the passport down on the counter. Then, without breaking eye contact, she reached beneath the desk and pumped hand sanitizer into her palm, once, twice, rubbing her hands together slowly, deliberately, the wet sound of it cutting straight through the noise of the gate. 2 passengers nearby exchanged a glance. Neither one said a word. A supervisor named Gary Whitmore appeared behind the counter a moment later. 55 years old, thinning hair combed carefully to one side, the kind of man who had built an entire career out of never making a decision that could be written down and used against him later. Debbie had called him over herself, saying, "Only I've got a situation at C31, and not explaining what the situation was, because after 9 years working alongside her, Gary already knew. He glanced at Renée's boarding pass, glanced at Renée, glanced back at Debbie. His mouth opened, then closed again. "Looks fine to me," he said, and set the pass back down and walked away. He did not ask Renée if she was all right. He did not address a single word of what Debbie had just done. There was nothing in those 3 words that could ever be quoted back to him in a hearing. And that, more than anything else, was the entire point of the way Gary Whitmore had learned to survive. Debbie watched him go. Her jaw tightened. She had called for backup, and instead, she had been made to look small in front of her own line, in front of this woman. And the humiliation went somewhere fast, straight into something meaner. She turned back to Renée, and her voice dropped low now, controlled, worse than shouting. "You people always try this," she said. "Show up with a ticket you can't afford, clothes that don't match, and expect the rest of us to just roll out a carpet." Renée said nothing. A man behind her checked his phone. A woman further back pulled her son closer by the shoulder and whispered something in his ear. Nobody said stop. Nobody said that's enough. The silence of 30 people who could have spoken and did not settled over the gate like something with weight. "I've seen it 100 times, Debbie went on, louder now. "Stolen cards, forged papers, borrowed tickets. You think I was born yesterday?" She picked the passport back up and held it beside Renée's face, comparing it out loud for the benefit of anyone still listening. "The photo's lighter," she announced. "The nose is different." She shook her head slowly, theatrically, and said it again, quieter this time, almost to herself. "You people forge everything. Disgusting." Then she flicked her wrist. It happened fast enough that half the gate missed it, and slow enough that the half who saw it would never forget it. The passport left her fingers at an upward angle, spun twice through the fluorescent light, and struck Renée square on the cheekbone, with a sound like a book snapping shut. It bounced off her face and hit the tile, landing exactly where it had fallen at the start of this story. The gate went silent, not the gradual quiet of a conversation fading out, but the instant kind, the kind where 30 people inhale at once and nobody remembers to exhale. Debbie leaned forward, crossed her arms on the counter, and tilted her head. "Pick it up," she said. "Get on your knees and pick it up. And when you're done, get out of my line. Because you are not getting on this plane. A teenager 4 rows back lifted his phone. A small red dot blinked in the corner of the screen. He said nothing. He just filmed. Renée bent down. Her knee touched the cold tile. Her fingers closed around the passport, and she could feel the faint sting where the edge had caught her cheek, a pulse of heat rising just beneath her eye. She stood back up slowly. Not because she had been broken, but because every movement she made was a choice. And she had spent 22 years choosing her movements under conditions far worse than this one. She slid the passport back into her blazer pocket, the same pocket that held her appointment letter and her father's coin. Then she took out her phone. She did not call anyone. She did not raise her voice. She opened a blank note and typed in 12 seconds the way a person types when they have written incident reports for 2 decades. Date, time, Gate C31, Denver International, Concourse C employee, Debbie Kessler. Incident, boarding document thrown at passenger's face. Supervisor present, Gary Whitmore, no intervention. Witnesses, approximately 30. Behind the counter, Megan Ortiz stood frozen, her hands gripping the edge of the desk so hard her knuckles had gone pale. This was not the first time she had watched something like this happen. 3 weeks earlier, she had watched Debbie send an elderly black veteran through secondary screening for a ticket that was never altered. In January, she had watched Debbie cancel a Hispanic family's seats and call it a system error. She had seen the pattern for 8 months and documented nothing, said nothing, until this exact moment. Her thumb hovered over an anonymous reporting app she had opened weeks ago and never once had the courage to use. 3 gates down at C28, a man in a windbreaker sat with a paperback open on his knee, crew cut, square jaw, combat boots tucked under his seat. Command Sergeant Major Walter Dobbins, retired after 30 years of service, had watched the whole scene unfold from a distance, close enough to read the shape of it even without hearing every word. The flinch when the passport struck skin, the slow, deliberate kneel, the controlled rise afterward. That's not a civilian response, he thought to himself. That's discipline. That woman has been trained. He did not get up. He would regret that later. For now he only watched, and he remembered, because remembering was the one thing 30 years in uniform had trained him never to stop doing. Meanwhile, Debbie had already moved on to the next passenger, a couple in their 50s, and the switch in her face flipped instantly back to warm. "Welcome aboard," she said, touching the woman's hand, laughing at the husband's joke about turbulence, printing their boarding passes with a little flourish. 15 feet away, Renée stood with her phone in one hand and her passport in the other, the mark on her cheek beginning to darken, watching Debbie work the counter like nothing at all had happened. A moment later, Debbie picked up the intercom and announced, in a voice that suddenly sounded almost pleasant, that the flight had been moved to a different gate. She leaned toward the couple in linen first, whispering the change personally, pointing them toward the right corridor with a warm hand on the shoulder. The family with the matching backpacks heard the announcement and began gathering their things. But 2 passengers near the back, a young mother with a toddler on her hip and an older man leaning on a cane, had their backs turned, talking quietly, and they never heard it at all. Nobody tapped their shoulders. Nobody pointed them in the right direction. Renée turned to them herself. "They changed the gate," she said. "It's this way." The young mother blinked, confused. The older man only shook his head slowly, saying, "3rd time this year," more to himself than to anyone listening. Renée helped the mother fold her stroller and walked with them both toward the new gate before circling back for her own bag. She found a seat at the end of a row, back against the wall, facing the corridor. An old habit from years spent in places where you always wanted to see who was coming. She unzipped the front pocket of her carry-on and slid out a thin manila folder held shut with a rubber band. A Department of Defense seal sat printed across the top page, beneath a block of red text. She did not need to read it. She already knew every word inside it. She only needed to hold something familiar in her hands, something that reminded her exactly who she was. Because the woman at gate C31 had just spent several minutes trying to convince her she was nothing at all. She closed the folder, she closed her eyes, and for a moment she was 6 years old again on a porch in Fayetteville, her father kneeling in front of her, his enormous hands wrapped gently around hers. "Baby girl," he had said. "People are going to look at you and decide who you are before you ever open your mouth. That's their problem. Your job is to know who you are so deep down that nobody's opinion can ever reach it." She had enlisted at 18, West Point at 21, her first deployment at 24. By 30, she had earned a Bronze Star. By 40, she stood among the highest-ranking black women in the entire oversight structure of the United States Army. She had been called worse things than what Debbie Kessler had called her that afternoon. Called them in places where the words came alongside gunfire. But there was something about this particular humiliation. In a fluorescent-lit terminal in her own country, surrounded by 30 people who watched and said nothing, that settled somewhere deeper than the others ever had. She opened her eyes and dialed a number she knew by memory. It rang twice. "Operations desk," a voice answered. "Inspector General's office." "This is Colonel Calloway," she said. "Authorization code 792 Echo. I need the full internal complaint history for Gate C31, Denver International, every report filed against Meridian Sky Airlines in the last 5 years, and the civil rights liaison for their corporate office. I want it on my desk before I land in Washington." She hung up, and something shifted quietly behind her eyes. Not tears, not anger. Something quieter and far more patient. The look of a woman who had just decided exactly how this would end, and who was in absolutely no hurry to get there. Back at Gate C31, Debbie Kessler was having the time of her life. The line had cleared. She leaned against the counter with a can of soda, retelling the whole story to 2 co-workers, snapping her wrist through the air to reenact the throw, tapping her own cheekbone for effect. "You should have seen her face when it hit," she said, laughing. "Just stood there like a deer. She had it coming, walking up here like she owns the place. First class, please." Megan Ortiz stood 3 feet away, restocking paper in the boarding pass printer, her jaw clenched so tight it ached. Her phone sat in her apron pocket, the reporting app still open from earlier. She typed 6 words into the description field. Debbie threw a passenger's ID at her face. Her thumb hovered over the submit button for a long moment. Then she pressed it. At the far end of the concourse, 3 figures in dress uniform walked in step, not parade ground precise but close enough that anyone who had served would recognize the rhythm immediately. They had come straight from a ceremony at a nearby base, and had not yet changed. Their shoes struck the polished floor in a way that made strangers step aside, without quite knowing why. A child tugged his mother's sleeve and pointed. Lieutenant General Robert Ashworth walked in front, 3 stars on his shoulders. Beside him, Major General Diane Foster, 2 stars, commander of the Army's Equal Opportunity Institute, a woman who had spent her entire career dismantling exactly the kind of behavior that had just occurred at Gate C31. Behind them, Brigadier General Marcus Webb, 1 star, from the Office of the Inspector General, the very man who would be handing Renée her new credentials the following Monday. They passed one gate, then another, glancing through the glass at each waiting area as they went. At C31, Ashworth slowed. Then he stopped completely. "Renée," he said, and his voice carried, without needing to be loud, the natural weight of a man who had spent 4 decades giving orders in rooms where the wrong word could start a war. He said her name the way you say the name of a friend you did not expect to see. Surprised. Warm. Certain. She looked up, 3 men stood at the edge of the waiting area, uniforms sharp enough to catch the overhead light, medals in careful rows across their chests, stars gleaming gold on their shoulders. She stood immediately, the way she always stood, when senior officers entered a room. 22 years of muscle memory that no pair of jeans could ever erase. Ashworth crossed the distance in a few long steps. He raised his hand, and instead of shaking hers, he saluted, full and formal, fingertips to brow, held there in front of 60 strangers in a civilian airport. To a woman, half of them had just watched get humiliated at a counter 30 feet away. "Colonel Calloway," he said, "good to see you." The gate went completely still. The man in the polo shirt froze mid-step. The teenager who had filmed the whole incident swung his phone toward the uniforms, mouth hanging open. "Colonel," someone whispered, and the word rippled backward through the waiting area like a stone, dropped into still water. "Wait, is that her?" "The one from the counter." Foster stepped forward and took Renée's hand in both of hers. "Congratulations on the appointment," she said. "The secretary signed off yesterday. You've earned every letter of it." Webb nodded once. "We'll make it official Monday," he said. "As far as I'm concerned, it starts now." Renée thanked them quietly, evenly. Ashworth tilted his head, studying her the way he'd studied her since she was a cadet. Reading her face the way he read a battlefield report, fast and accurate, without needing anyone to explain what was wrong. "What happened to your cheek?" he asked. Her hand rose toward the mark, then dropped back to her side. "It's nothing," she said. "Renée," he said again. And this time, it was not the voice of a general, but the voice of a mentor, the same one he had used years earlier in a field hospital overseas, when she had called a shrapnel wound. Just a scratch while her sleeve was soaked through with blood. She told him. She told him about the sanitizer, the 2 fingers, the words trash and disgusting, and you people, the passport spinning through the air, the order to get down on her knees. She told him about the laughter, the filming, the silence of 30 strangers who watched and did nothing. She told it, flat, precise, stripped of everything, except the facts, date, time, gate, employee name, number of witnesses, supervisor present, no intervention, as if she were reading it straight off an incident report. But her fingers were pressed against the mark on her cheek, and they were trembling, just barely, just enough for Ashworth to see it. The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the terminal. Ashworth's jaw tightened. Foster's grip on her briefcase turned her knuckles pale. Webb closed his eyes for a moment, the way a man does when he is choosing between anger and action, and chooses action. "Which gate?" Ashworth said. "C-31. She was there when I walked away." Ashworth turned to Foster. She already had her phone out, dialing. "This is Major General Foster," she said, the moment the call connected. "I need your government affairs liaison, not customer service." "A liaison? You have very little time." Webb turned to Renée. "I want a written statement filed through Inspector General channels before you board," he said. "I'll countersign it myself." "Already drafted," she said, holding up her phone, the note still open on the screen. 22 years, Webb said, almost to himself, "and you still document like a first lieutenant." "You taught me that, sir," she answered, and the ghost of a smile crossed his face and was gone. The 3 of them walked back toward Gate C-31 together. 6 stars moving down the concourse in a line that made strangers step aside without being asked. At the counter, Debbie was still laughing with her coworkers when she saw them coming from 50 feet away. Her smile did not fade gradually. It dropped all at once, the way a mask drops when the string holding it snaps. Her soda tipped over the edge of the counter and spilled across the keyboard. She did not notice. Ashworth reached the counter first. He did not slow down, and he did not announce himself. He simply stood there, hands clasped behind his back, 3 stars catching the overhead light, and the room around him went quiet on its own. "I need your name," he said. Debbie's voice cracked on the first syllable. "Debbie," she managed. Debbie Kessler. Miss Kessler, I'm Lieutenant General Robert Ashworth, United States Army. I need to speak with your supervisor, immediately. Debbie reached for the phone, with a hand shaking badly enough that she missed the receiver on her first try. Gary Whitmore arrived a few minutes later, adjusting his tie, expecting a routine complaint, a delayed bag, maybe a seating dispute. He stopped mid-stride the moment he saw the uniforms. Mr. Whitmore, Ashworth said, approximately an hour ago, one of your employees physically assaulted a colonel of the United States Army at this gate. She threw a boarding document into the colonel's face, made racially motivated remarks in front of roughly 30 witnesses, and ordered the colonel to kneel on the floor to retrieve her own identification. I want the security footage from this gate, every angle, from the moment she arrived, now. There must be some misunderstanding, Whitmore started. Debbie is one of our senior. There is no misunderstanding, Ashworth said, and his voice did not rise even slightly. The footage, Mr. Whitmore. The airport's security office sat 3 floors up, a wall of monitors covering hundreds of cameras across the terminal. A retired police sergeant named Wallace Turner pulled up the feed from gate C31 within seconds. 2 angles, overhead and side, both clear enough to read faces. He played it once at normal speed and once at half speed, and by the second viewing his own jaw had tightened. That's assault, he said, plain and simple. In a small conference room nearby, Foster sat across from Megan Ortiz, who had come forward the moment security called her name. Megan's hands sat folded in her lap, her eyes red. "Take your time," Foster said gently. Megan didn't need time. She had been waiting 8 months to say all of it. "It's never the first time with Debbie," she said. 3 weeks ago, there was an elderly black veteran, medals pinned right to his jacket. And she sent him through secondary screening because she said his ticket looked altered. It wasn't. She just didn't want him sitting up front. In January, she canceled a Hispanic family's seats and called it a system glitch. There was a woman in a hijab she called security on for reading a book. I've watched it happen at least a dozen times. Everyone knows. Nobody says anything. Gary signs off on every complaint and it just disappears. "Did you ever report it?" Foster asked. "I was scared," Megan said. "She's been here 9 years. I've been here 8 months. "Not anymore," Foster said, and wrote something in her notebook. Webb pulled Gary Whitmore's records through a corporate liaison, who arrived in a cold sweat. 8 formal complaints against Debbie Kessler over 4 years. Every single one filed by a passenger of color. Every single one closed with identical language. Misunderstanding. Employee counseled. No further action required. Whitmore had copy-pasted the same sentence 8 times without even bothering to update the date formatting between entries. "Did you investigate any of these?" Webb asked. "I spoke with Debbie each time," Whitmore said. "She assured me it was a misunderstanding." "Did you review the footage?" Silence. "Did you contact any of the passengers who filed these complaints?" Silence. 8 complaints, 4 years, all from passengers of color, all dismissed without a single investigation. "And you signed everyone," Webb said. "That is not negligence, Mr. Whitmore. That is a pattern." Command Sergeant Major Dobbins found the security office on his own, walking up 3 flights of stairs because nobody had asked him to. "Nobody told me to come," he said, sitting down across from Turner, "but I saw the whole thing, and I want it on the record." He gave his statement in the clipped, exact language of a man who had written after-action reports for 3 decades, describing the hostile exchange, the deliberate wrist motion, the composure of the woman on the receiving end. Her response was military-grade discipline, he said. "I'd bet my pension on it. I should have said something in the moment. I didn't. That's on me. But I'm here now." By the time Debbie was escorted to a small windowless office on the 2nd floor, the story had already left the building. The teenager's video, shaky and vertical, had climbed past 1 million views within a few hours of being posted. No caption, no commentary, just the footage speaking for itself. A hashtag with Renée's rank and name attached climbed to the top of national trends by the end of the day. News vans gathered outside the terminal's main entrance. Meridian Sky Airlines issued a holding statement promising a thorough internal review, which satisfied absolutely no one, and the company's stock dropped sharply in after-hours trading. None of it had reached Debbie yet. She sat alone under a buzzing fluorescent light, and she did not know any of it. Because her legs had carried her into that room, and her brain had simply stopped working somewhere along the way. An internal affairs investigator named Patricia Lang sat down across from her, opened a laptop, and pressed play. Debbie watched herself on the screen. The sanitizer, the 2 fingers, the throw, the smirk, the switch flipping back on for the next passenger. She watched it twice. The second time, her lips pressed together so hard, they turned white. "It looks worse than it was," Debbie said. She was being difficult. She didn't belong. Didn't belong where, Miss Kessler? In first class. She didn't look like a first-class passenger. "What does a first-class passenger look like?" Lang asked. Debbie opened her mouth and closed it again. "The passenger you threw a passport at is Colonel Renée Calloway," Lang said. 22 years in the United States Army. Distinguished Service Medal, Bronze Star. She was appointed Deputy Inspector General of the Department of Defense yesterday. On what basis did you decide she didn't belong? Debbie's mouth hung open. Nothing came out. Would it have mattered, Lang asked, if she hadn't been a colonel at all? If she'd simply been a woman flying home to see her family? The question sat in the room like smoke that would not clear. Debbie stared at the frozen frame on the laptop screen. Her own hand caught mid-flick, the passport suspended in the air between her fingers and Renée's face. She stared at it for a very long time, and something in her face began slowly to come apart. The following morning, the airline's chief executive, a man named Nathaniel Cross, stood behind a podium with his tie slightly crooked and did not bother to fix it. "What happened at Gate C-31 is indefensible," he said. "It does not reflect who we are, but it reveals what we allowed to happen, and that is on us." He announced the decisions one by one. Debbie Kessler, terminated effective immediately. A formal written apology to be issued to Colonel Calloway. Gary Whitmore, removed from all supervisory duties, reassigned pending a separate inquiry into 8 prior complaints he had personally buried. 2 additional managers placed on probation for the same silence. "We failed," Cross said. "Not once but repeatedly over 4 years, and we are going to fix it. Not because the world is watching, but because it should have been fixed the very first time someone told us something was wrong." The reforms came quickly after that. Mandatory anti-discrimination training for the entire workforce, developed in partnership with Foster's own institute, an irony not lost on a single person involved. A new zero-tolerance policy, with real consequences attached. An independent review board for passenger complaints, staffed entirely by outside attorneys instead of internal management. A pilot program for body-worn cameras at high traffic gates. The Department of Transportation announced its own oversight review 2 days later, and the airline had no choice left but to cooperate fully. Renée held a press conference the following week, wearing her dress uniform. The mark on her cheek faded now to a shadow you would only notice if you already knew where to look. "What happened to me at Gate C-31," she said, "happens to travelers of color in this country every single day. At airports, at hotels, at counters, just like that one. The only difference between my story and theirs is that 3 generals happened to walk through the door behind me. Most people don't get that. Most people pick up whatever fell on the floor, swallow what they're feeling, and get on the plane anyway, or they don't get on the plane at all, and they go home and tell their families, and nothing changes. The system has to work for everyone, especially when nobody important is watching. Especially when there are no cameras and no stars on anyone's shoulders. That is the standard. and we are not there yet." She took no questions. She stepped away from the podium and disappeared through a side door, while the cameras kept rolling on the empty space where she had been standing. 3 weeks later, Megan Ortiz received a letter promoting her 2 levels ahead of schedule and appointing her to a newly created role: Passenger Dignity Officer, the first position of its kind the airline had ever created. Her job was to monitor gate interactions and serve as an advocate for anyone who felt they had been treated unfairly. The role existed because she had pressed a single button on her phone, in a moment when pressing it could have cost her everything she had. Debbie Kessler walked out of the airline's regional office on an ordinary Tuesday morning, carrying a cardboard box with a coffee mug she had owned for 9 years. No reporters waited for her outside. The story had already moved on to something else, the way stories always do. She sat in her car, in the parking lot for a long while before she finally started the engine. And in the weeks that followed, she found herself replaying, over and over, a single frozen image she could not stop seeing: her own wrist snapping forward, the passport suspended in the air, a stranger's face on the other side of it. She had spent 9 years believing she was simply upholding a standard. It took losing everything to understand that the standard she had been upholding was never anything but her own fear dressed up as judgment, and that the woman she had humiliated had done nothing in that line, except stand there and wait her turn like everybody else. 6 months later, Gate C-31 looked almost exactly the same. Same fluorescent lights, same blinking camera in the corner. But a new sign now hung on the wall behind the counter, white letters on navy blue, reading "Every passenger deserves dignity." A sign Megan had requested herself, and which management had approved within a single day. A company record. Megan stood behind that counter in a new uniform, with a new badge, the same smile she had worn on her very first day. Except now it meant something different, because now she had earned the right to stand there. An older woman approached with silver hair and nervous hands, placing her boarding pass down too gently, the way people do when they have been made to feel like they are asking for too much. "First class, ma'am," Megan said. "Welcome aboard. Window seat, row 2. Can I help you with your bag?" The woman blinked, waiting for the catch. There was no catch. "Thank you," she said quietly, almost surprised. "Of course," Megan answered. "Have a wonderful flight." The woman walked toward the jet bridge, and by the time she reached the door, her shoulders had loosened and she was standing a little taller than when she arrived. In an office at the Pentagon, Colonel Renée Calloway sat behind a desk she was still getting used to. A nameplate reading Deputy Inspector General, still new enough to catch the light strangely. A 6-month review sat open in front of her. Complaints from travelers of color, down by nearly half since the new policies took effect. Reports of employee misconduct up sharply, not because behavior had gotten worse, but because people were finally willing to report it. She read the numbers twice and closed the folder. Not perfect, not even close. But movement, real, measured, documented movement. The kind that never makes a headline, but quietly changes what happens in the ordinary moments at counters and gates and lines where nobody important is watching at all. She reached into her blazer pocket, the same pocket she had carried for years, and found the small brass coin still there, worn smooth on one side, duty above self, pressed faintly into the metal. She touched it once, the way she always did, and then let it go. 3 weeks after that, she flew out of Denver again, in civilian clothes, the same worn carry-on over her shoulder, the same steel watch on her wrist. A gate agent glanced at her boarding pass and smiled without hesitation. "Welcome aboard, ma'am. First class. Can I help with anything?" "No, thank you," said. "I'm good." And she walked down the jet bridge, took her seat by the window, and watched the tarmac stretch out toward a pale morning sky. Dignity was never supposed to be something you had to earn through rank, or a title, or Three generals walking through a door at exactly the right moment. It was supposed to be the floor. Everyone stood on the second they walked through any door at all. And every single person who had watched that afternoon unfold at gate C31 and said nothing had learned, whether they wanted to or not, that silence is never really neutral. It always ends up standing on somebody's side.